back. Chapter 19, Black Fortunes. Let's get it. End of the promise. Gurley's reputation in Greenwood was boasted by his beating of the 3 white men who harassed his wife. For a moment, it seemed that the richest black man in Greenwood was putting aside his ambitions and pragmatism and becoming a man of the people. It didn't last. In 1918, O.W. Gurley was charged with bribery by 2 women in Greenwood. According to the complaint, Gurley took 2 rings from the 2 black women to keep them out of jail. Gurley, who was Tulsa's sheriff's deputy and charged with police in Greenwood, was rumored to have regularly demanded bribes from people accused of crimes in Greenwood in exchange for not arresting them. Gurley escaped jail and kept his sheriff's deputy badge, but rumors of corruption dented his reputation. In 1919, as the black newspapers carried news of Madam C.J. Walker's death, 3 black men were arrested in Tulsa on the suspicion of shooting a white iron worker. The men were transported to the Tulsa County Jail, just across the train tracks from Greenwood in the white section of Tulsa, and put into a cell together. Word traveled through the grapevine back to Tulsa that a white mob had plans to take the men from the cell that night and lynch them. Within hours, a posse of black men were organized. More than 24 black men carrying revolvers and rifles marched across the train tracks to the jail and barged in. They demanded to see the prisoners and got into a shouting match with the police. As the confrontation escalated, men on both sides began to move their fingers towards the trigger of their guns. As the tension reached a breaking point, Gurley sauntered through the door. His hair was now gray and he wore glasses with thick circular lenses. He was a rich man and wore an expensive suit on his broad frame with a sheriff's star pinned on his breast and a pistol at his side. He walked up to the police chief and the 2 walked away conversing in whispers. A few moments later, a deal had been brokered. Gurley was given assurances that the men wouldn't be harmed and the police would allow the group from Greenwood to check on the prisoners if they left immediately thereafter. A delegation of the men from the group, escorted by an officer, went back to check on the men in the cell. A few minutes later, they came back, reporting that the prisoners were being treated well, and the men went back to Greenwood. The aftermath would send chills through white Tulsa. The independence and strength of Greenwood had been reluctantly tolerated as long as Gurley could keep the blacks under control. But this armed invasion, as it was later called, set off alarms. The Negroes were getting out of their place. A few months later, a white man was accused of assaulting a black woman on a trolley in downtown Tulsa. Gurley obtained a warrant for the man, but was forbidden from arresting him. Tulsa Sheriff William McColgan reportedly ripped the warrant from Gurley's hand, stating that he would never allow a black man to serve a warrant on a white man in Tulsa. In response, Gurley resigned as the sheriff's deputy and handed McColgan his badge. In 1921, Gurley was the richest and most powerful man in Greenwood. He was a landlord to half the town's residents and shopkeepers, collecting $5,000 or $68,000 approximately a month in rents. With more than 100 properties in Greenwood, he was worth between $500,000 and $1 million, which would be between $6.8 million and $13.6 million. His net worth could only be guessed at in Greenwood, as Gurley kept his own money across the tracks in the white banks in downtown Tulsa. His hotel, valued at least $99,000 or $1.35 million, was one of the busiest in the district. J.B. Stratford, Greenwood's other founding father, was growing more popular. In 1918, he helped organize an armed group to turn back a lynch mob in nearby Bristow, Oklahoma. In Greenwood, Stratford's more militant approach to civil rights became increasingly popular. In 1920, with the help of A.J. Smitherin, he brought W.E.B. Du Bois to Greenwood. Gurley didn't protest. In fact, he put him up in his hotel. Du Bois gave several lectures to the residents, focusing on the need for blacks to become economically self-reliant and push back against lynching. In a fiery speech in a theater, he looked out onto the faces of hundreds of Tulsa blacks and spoke romantically about the burgeoning artistic renaissance in Harlem, New York, advocated for African Americans to organize for their rights, and urged the people of Greenwood to protect their own people from lynching. On a rainy Memorial Day in 1921, Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building in Tulsa through 2 glass doors to use the only colored bathroom on the block. which was at the top of the building. Roland was a 19-year-old high school dropout who worked shining shoes at the stand outside the office building. He was tall, confident, and outgoing. In Greenwood, where he had grown up and still resided, he was known for showing his billfold and wearing an earring with his nickname, Diamond Dick, and was thought by most to be harmless. He walked through the lobby and entered the elevator. On board was the elevator operator, a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. The door closed for a moment, and then a scream came out. When the doors opened again, Sarah ran away. A white clerk who had heard her scream called the police. When the police arrived, they didn't make much of the incident. They questioned Roland, sent him home, and quietly began to ask around about the incident. "We did not attach sufficient importance to the event," one police captain remembered. "It all just seemed like a misunderstanding." The next day, newspaper boys greeted people in the streets pushing papers with the headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." "Negro assaults white girl," they cried. The evidence that anything had happened was flimsy, but stories of black on white sexual assault always made for lucrative headlines and strong newspaper sales. The details of the story were mostly fabricated. Nevertheless, they incited calls for Roland to be locked up or worse. Later that day, the same officers who had let Roland go went to his house, took him away, and put him into a cell in the courthouse. Once Roland was in jail, talk of lynching him spread among white men in Tulsa. Calls began to come into the police chief from the organizing of lynch mobs. The next day, the Tulsa Tribune ran an editorial encouraging lynching, titled, "To Lynch a Negro Tonight." Late that afternoon, O.W. Gurley arrived at the courthouse to see the police chief. He, too, had heard that a lynch mob was being gathered for Roland. "Gurley, there won't be any lynching as long as I'm sheriff," he assured Gurley. "If you keep your folks away from here, there won't be any trouble." Gurley accepted his assurance and headed back to Greenwood to keep things under control. The police hoped that if they could prevent a racial standoff, bloodshed could be avoided. Early in the evening, the police chief's phone rang. A voice said, "We're going to lynch that Negro tonight, that black devil that assaulted that white girl." Then the line went dead. A few hours later, a crowd gathered on the courthouse steps with men demanding that Dick Roland be brought out. "You might as well go home because no one is going to get the Negro," the police chief told the mob leaders. Inside, Sarah Page was being questioned by police officers. She said the incident might have been a mistake, and she equivocated about pressing charges. Nonetheless, the white mob outside grew angrier and angrier, even as the sexual assault accusation was falling apart. Roland's cell was on the top floor of the courthouse, accessible only by elevator. The chief ordered 5 deputies to disable the elevator and stand guard in front of its door. Nobody would be lynching him tonight. When Gurley returned from the courthouse, he found men in Greenwood in a state of agitation over fears that Roland would be lynched. Many younger men were gathering ammunition and weapons and planning to go to the courthouse to protect Roland. Gurley spoke to a group of them in the street outside his hotel. He told them that he had just spoken with authorities and that the police would protect Roland. "You're a damn liar," a man named Anderson shouted at Gurley. "They're going to take him out. Fellow, you ought to be put in jail right now," Gurley snapped back at Anderson. The man pulled his pistol from his hip and aimed it at Gurley, who was sure he was about to be shot. An older lawyer named Spears jumped in between them and talked Anderson into putting the gun away. Down the street, a lawyer named B.C. Franklin heard the fracas and rushed from his rooming house into the street. He found 2 World War I veterans, one black and one white, exciting the crowd with talk of war. "We need to bomb one of the buildings," they shouted. Franklin, a hypnotic orator, told the crowd that such action would lead to the destruction of Greenwood and possibly the deaths of everyone there. After his speech, the crowd dispersed. Despite the best efforts of Gurley and Greenwood's elders, a group of 75 lightly armed men left Greenwood and went to the courthouse at 7:30 that night. Police Chief William McCullard dispatched a deputy to deal with them when they arrived. "Boy, where are you going?" the deputy asked. "We're coming to see about the lynching," one of the Greenwood men said. The deputy replied, "Now this boy is upstairs and the cage is locked upstairs and there is no way anyone can get to him. Go back." The group left without incident, walking north across the train tracks to Greenwood. A little over an hour later, as Greenwood's elders went back to their homes, young men and women gathered in pool halls, bars, and theaters. Among them, a wild rumor somehow spread that Roland had been taken from the jail and lynched. By 9:30, a group of men with guns drove down to the courthouse. As they arrived, the barrels of their rifles and pistols gleamed under the streetlights. The police chief came out to deal with them. "Now you men listen to me," he shouted. "Go home before a lot of people get hurt. You have no business coming up here parading around guns like that. If you are law-abiding people, you will go home before the real trouble starts." "We will go home when we get that Negro boy you want to lynch," one of the men shouted back, as others cheered him. "We ain't going nowhere," they chorused. "No one is going to be lynched here," the police chief told them. "There is not going to be a charge against the young man." The white woman had admitted that he did not harm her. She said she was nervous and scared, so she screamed when he grabbed her. That is all there is to this case. She is a very nervous person, but she said she is not going to press charges as no harm was done. "So go home now. I give you my word the Negro will be released in the morning. If there's no charge, why don't you turn him over to us now?" a man asked. "That is not possible," the sheriff answered. "Why not?" another asked. "Because he's telling a damn lie," another shouted. "If we leave him here, he's a goner. They'll hang him like the Judgment Day." The sheriff remained calm. "Listen to me," he said. "Nobody is going to hang anybody from this jail, but I can't turn him over to you tonight. Only a judge can release somebody who's been charged with a crime." He then added, "We can't give in to lawlessness, so go home before trouble starts." The men mumbled among themselves, then turned and went home to Greenwood. A large group of them retreated to the bars and began drinking. Shortly after they left, a group of armed white men showed up. They stationed themselves around the courthouse, readying themselves to fight if another group of armed black men returned. Later in the night, after the bars and theaters closed for the night, a group of men who had gone to the courthouse earlier made their way back, still armed and now drunk. They flashed their guns as they approached and again confronted the sheriff on the courthouse steps. "Parading around with those guns is against the law," he told them as the white mob watched. "Violence is easy to start but hard to stop." He pointed to the top floor of the courthouse where snipers were positioned with rifles. "Look up at those windows. See those gun barrels pointed at you? They will cut you down before the first person reaches the courthouse. Now go home before a lot of people get shot." As he was speaking, a white man approached the steps. "What are you going to do with that pistol?" "I'm going to use it if I need to." "No, you will give it to me." "Like hell I will." Two men then began to struggle over the gun. A shot was discharged into the air as they fought. Then all hell broke loose. A hail of bullets came from the white mob, hitting several of the blacks on the steps. Those who could moved into alleys and started to run toward Greenwood. Men in cars with gun barrels protruding from the windows mowed down people who tried to escape, as others were picked off by gunfire from the mob of the white men gathered at the foot of the courthouse. As the men raced back into Greenwood, the rioters followed them, shooting up buildings. The initial gunfire was followed by explosions as groups of armed white men moved from the courthouse steps into Greenwood. The men fired guns into buildings and homes and threw bombs through windows. Gurley was lying awake in bed with his wife Emma in their apartment at the top floor of the Gurley Hotel when the fighting started. He could smell smoke and hear gunfire in the distance. When the sun came up, he looked out his window to see smoke and flames. The violence had been followed by waves of looters who burnt blacks out of their homes and looted stores, taking some blacks as hostages and killing others in the streets. Gurley ran downstairs and outside into the street in the smoke-filled air. He heard gunshots and cracking fire. Greenwood was burning. Through the smoke, he saw 6 white men down the street holding shotguns, rifles, jugs of gasoline, and torches. One of the men walked up on Gurley and motioned toward his hotel. "You better get out of that hotel because we're going to burn all this goddamn stuff. You better get all your guests out." The men left Gurley and went down the street, door to door, telling people to evacuate before they started burning. Gurley ran back inside, found Emma sitting in the rocking chair near the window of the bedroom, looking outside and shaking in fright. "We need to go, Emma. Their fire is going to get us," he told her. "It's going to get everyone." "But where will we go if the fire is everywhere?" Emma said. "I don't know," Gurley replied. The girlies decided to try to run south across the train tracks to White Tulsa. The people knew Gurley there. He'd been the reasonable one who had tried to keep the young men of Greenwood in line. Surely they'd spare him. Surely someone would give him shelter. When they got outside, 2 white men with guns started shooting at the couple. Emma fell to the ground. "Don't worry about me. You need to run," she told Gurley. Gurley took off without saying goodbye or looking back. Wow. As Gurley ran, he saw the National Guard and mobs of white men pouring into Greenwood. He was grabbed by some members of the Guard who were removing blacks from Greenwood and quarantining them at a baseball park just across the tracks. At the park, Gurley was isolated. The constituents of the district he built stared at him without speaking. They blamed him, his racial constellation, his self-interest. "My lord, it's Gurley." O.W. turned to see Emma up in the stadium's bleachers. She ran down to Gurley and they embraced. O.W. had lost the faith of his people. He had lost his dream. And he would eventually lose more than $250,000, which would be about $3.4 million today, in the riots. But at that moment, he was glad he hadn't lost Emma too. After the riots, he tried to sell his ruined lands to the local railroad company for $25,000, approximately $340,000. But the deal fell through. In the months afterward, he moved to a 4-bedroom house in South Los Angeles and opened a hotel. A rumor spread that he was dead, that he had been lynched during the violence. Gurley was not dead, but his dream was. In the end, he sold his land to other African Americans in Greenwood, who ultimately stayed there and began to rebuild. In 1926, W.E.B. Du Bois visited Greenwood. The riot's damage had been repaired and new buildings had risen. Looking on the resilient black faces of the Promised Land, he wrote, "Black Tulsa is a happy city. It has new clothes. It is young and gay and strong. 5 little years ago, fire and blood and robbery leveled it to the ground. Scars are there, but the city is impudent and noisy. It believes in itself. Thank God for the grit of Black Tulsa." And that was chapter 19. One more chapter left.